Hey guys, welcome to this final Maya video where we will go over the overall procedure for what kind of pipeline we're looking at here when we're going to work with this. The reason for this video is really like you don't really need to watch this if you understand entirely what you're doing, as in if you have no problems so far. But essentially, because Maya is such a big piece of software that really you can actually specialize within Maya. I think it's really important to understand the grand scheme of things, because at the end of the day, once you get enough experience, you may hire someone who will be, let's say, your dedicated animator. But imagine that you only have enough money to hire one guy, so you're either going to hire an animator who's going to be able to rig, or a modeler who's not going to be that good with rigging or animating. Now, obviously, these people will be able to perform multiple duties, but in general, the more success we are, the more financing you have, the more specializations you want to be drilling into. And these people need to work together. Um, Imagine that you're filling in for your animator, right? And you need to know how to basically fill in for someone, because yeah, you're not going to get as good a job done, but you're not going to screw it up for them for the next guy. Or a rigger, right? Or imagine you don't have enough resources, like like money to hire, let's say, I don't know, like a texturing guy, like an artist, or an actual 3D model or a sculptor, right? And you want to do this, but you need to hand it off to your animator, right? And you want to be sure that you get your topology right and all that. So you got to know essentially how the pipeline works, right? How all these UVs and all that jazz is done, because it's a huge piece of software. So I'm actually gonna go ahead and open up Draw.io. I think it's important to have this thing visualized. To be fair, I think with Windows's new Paint and all that jazz, I think it's possible. I think it's possible to have, like with this OneNote thing. I haven't tried it exactly how well it works, but let's just use this for now. I think it's the simplest solution here. So what you need to understand is, even though Maya, right, is a let me just put this right here in the middle, somewhere in the middle, like so. So this is Maya, right? I'm gonna just write down Maya, and we're gonna make this blue. So this is your overall, this is like your software package. Now Maya, we're gonna export from Maya into Substance Painter, right? Remember, this is our workflow. We're gonna export from Maya into the Unreal Engine project, but this is so that we can open up with Painter. Okay, so essentially you are getting sort of like we create sort of like some kind of triangle here, right? And essentially you'd be going it'd be going basically both ways. So let me just see here. What was the trick for this thing? Yeah, so there's like gonna be a communication between UE4. We're gonna make UE4 red because it's the cool color, right? And basically what we're doing is there's this communication between Maya Painter and UE4. So basically you export something into UE4 with Maya, right? And then you import it into Painter, and Painter does its own thing. Or you can directly export into Painter if you so desire. But I like to work with this hierarchy where we go through Unreal Engine's hierarchy, because we can go, this is where my Perforce is set up, so I can actually source control, version control my my imports, which is important because sometimes you may find yourself that the new things actually are not as good as the old things, and you might want to revert this, right? So you do want to have version control on your binary assets, not just on your code or your levels or the stuff that's inside the engine. So that being said, Maya is actually broken up into many different things, as is UE4 and Painter. To be fair, we could actually go ahead and create a whole tree here on each side of this triangle, and you will see that there's going to be like a huge difference in terms of these. But Maya obviously has a pretty big workflow. So if I go ahead and just blow this up, and let's say there's like a bunch of things that go into this. So first we have I'm actually going to make this yellow, right? So first we have our modeling, okay? And then I'm going to duplicate this, and this is going to be our, so we model our object, right? And then we're going to actually go ahead and create a rig for it. So rigging, you've got this bit. So you've got your rigging. I'm going to duplicate this again. After that, you've got your UVs, right? You got your UVs. After that, you've got your skinning, right? And after that, you've got your animation, right? So obviously in modeling, I could say that this thing, let's say, breaks up into sculpting, NURBS, well, polygons, right? So you have several methods of modeling, and you can just copy this and say NURBS. So these are your three methods of modeling, unless you're in the future when VR modeling is the way to go. But as it is right now, and even in the future when you have VR, probably a geometry will be represented in one of these three terms, unless there's something real fancy going on. So you've got these kind of relationships here, right? You can ignore this bit here, like so, because we don't need an input, actually in this case an actual output. So this only goes into modeling, and obviously modeling is part of Maya. So your overall pipeline is as follows. I'm just going to go ahead and grab these and turn them into purple, because these are your setup. So I hope you're starting to understand how this whole thing works. Now I'm going to delete this because that doesn't have much sense. Now you've got your modeling. After you model, you essentially rig. After you rig, you UV your model, right? Well, to be fair, you can UV it beforehand, but you want to be done with, make sure that you got your topology right and all that, and you create your skeleton afterwards, right? If you're gonna model, if you're gonna, assuming you're gonna animate this, right? But usually rigging is also, you know, it's part of. They're actually broken down in two different categories. I'm gonna use, I'm gonna just grab this, right, and I'm gonna scale this down a little bit. So you've got your actual driving rig, right, and then you've got your control rig. Control rig. Okay, so essentially you perform, these are your the two rigs that you need to make sure that they work. Okay, you need to set these up in such a way that they both operate between each other. And if I can only grab a particularly interesting, there we go, it's much better. So you got your rigging, which includes your driving rig, which is your skeleton, right? And then you've got your control rig, which are your controls, right? And I'm gonna make this, I'm running out of colors here, orange. So as you can see, there's loads of things here in the UVs as well. After that, you UV your model after you have your topology set up, and then you skin it, obviously, to your rig, and then you animate it. And within the animation, you've got all these different things, such as let's go ahead and duplicate this, and you've got your blend shapes, which are essentially morph targets, right? And then you've got your vertex animation, which is just your vertices or objects, which just the way objects transform. And then you've got your let me just go ahead here, and then you've got your deformers, which are technically part of your vertex animation, but I'm not gonna go that in depth here with all of these with this table here, because to be fair, I think it's fairly self-explanatory. If you've been following along, you'll know what you're doing here. So you've got your blend shapes, your vertex animation, the deformers, which the deformers work with both the skeleton and with vertex, and you basically got loads of options. So these are also part of your overall workflow here. So you really realize that it's just not as easy to, how can I set this up now here? Okay, just move this above here, and then just go like this. If I can only move it over here would be nice. There we go. So you've got this bit. This did not move that well. Can I get it? Can I get it? Oh, there we go. I got it. So yeah, these are your your available tools, and that's just like obviously the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more stuff here when it comes to animating. Obviously, you've got your you know, special drivers like set driven keys, right? Where you get your driven keys here. Not to mention you got different toolkits. So such as, right, you got a workflow with the graph editor, with the animation layers, right? We can actually go ahead and create an entire setup over here like this, and just duplicate this on the other side and just scale it outwards. I believe it's possible to scale this thing outwards. No, whole thing. No, gonna have to do this the manual way, and I just cannot be bothered, to be honest with you. So I'm just gonna ignore this. But what you know what I'm saying here. You don't need visual representation for your workflow. But the pipeline, that's how it looks, right? Okay, you've got your modeling, which includes your sculpting, polygons, and NURBS. Then the output from your modeling goes into the rigging. So you basically start creating a skeleton, or you know, anything that you're going to have to control with a driver, which would be your driving rig. And if you have a driving rig, you're going to need a control rig. If you have a human, you're going to need a human IK rig. Or, you know, if you're really into it, you're going to have to like a FK IK setup, which is a lot more complicated, and we haven't gone over it. Nor have we gone over human IK, but it's a fairly simple system to work with. So if you understand the concept of rigging, you can just watch like one YouTube video and you'll figure out how to use a human IK. But the point is that after you've got your driving rig, then you need to set up a control rig. Now for human IK, this is a lot simpler than doing this for anything else, because Maya is going to create your driving rig and it's going to create your control rig at the same time. Okay, and it's very easy to animate humans. It's actually arguably easier to animate humans than creatures, because for creatures you need to create your own rig and then you need to create your own control rig, whereas humanoids are generally bipedals, right? Bipeds. So anything that's a biped, right, with two hands and two legs, Maya can is, you know, it's pretty robust for animating humans and all that jazz, and that's normal. Obviously, the prevailing like the majority of things that you see have something to do with humans. So whether it be a game or a movie, right, you'll be having a human influence. Now all these things, they're fine and all, but then you need your UVs. So before you actually go ahead and skin your object, you need to have the UVs done. After you, obviously you do this after you have your topology set up. So you do your UVs, and then you do your skinning, and then you do your animation, right? And after you do all of that, you bake it all in and export. So all of this goes, after you're done with that, you basically go into Maya, and that is at the end of your journey in Maya. If I can just grab it, perhaps. I wonder if I can turn this around over here. Oh, there we go. It fits very nicely. So yeah, you basically go ahead and grab this thing, and what can I use here for this? Let's use this gray color. So you export your animation, right? You bake it in, you export. Remember to bake your stuff, okay? Remember to basically don't do stupid things. Follow what we've talked about, right? Get all these things. Don't delete your deformers unless you have to. Follow your history. Keep your outliner, right? Keep your scene outliner organized. Don't export useless things such as cameras and lights unless you plan on using those in an engine. But the point is that this is the whole workflow. This is what we've gone through actually so far. We've gone through everything on this chart with the possible exception of the human IK. Although I do think that it's easy enough to understand how it works. Okay, so this is a solid baseline on how you can work with Maya and how your creation process for an asset actually works. Now somewhere here in between, if we didn't have Painter, because we're using Painter for a process, like a step here, which we're ignoring, which would be probably over here between UVs and skinning. Essentially, once you have your model and your UVs, to be fair, these two are interchangeable. You could do your UVs right after you're done with modeling. A lot of people prefer that, but I like to rig my stuff first and see how it's going to look and maybe move it around a little bit before I go ahead and UV it. It's like maybe I could skin it in. This is obviously not a set thing, but you can't start any of these without modeling. So you need to model your object, and then whether you UV it first and then you rig it and then you skin it and then you animate, or if you decide to rig it first and then skin it and then animate it and only then detach your stuff and then create UVs. Although it's not a good idea to create your UVs after the animation. But you know, if you don't have any textures, it's fine. Usually, if we would have textures, it would be right after the UVs. Like the textures almost always go after the UVs, because what you do is you create your UVs, right? You create your materials, textures, and all that jazz. Um, and you know, these, in order for them to fit correctly, you need to actually have your UVs done. And after that, you rig, skin, and animate and see how your texture deforms, if it stretches, if there's any problems with all that, and then you gotta polish all that jazz out. We're gonna be doing this in Painter, so we haven't done anything with Hypershade or any of them material editors in Maya. And we haven't painted any textures yet, none of that jazz. The only thing possibly that we will do before we start talking about Painter, as we start talking about Painter, is selection sets for the Painter, right? So there's many different ways you can use your UV shells as selection sets. You could use your different materials, which I prefer that. Just assign different materials to different, like, to what I want to have different stuff, basically, like layers. That's why I said that it would be very beneficial if you've used Photoshop before, so that you just understand the workflow with layers and all that. So yeah, that's not to say that. Look, I'm not gonna go through Photoshop with you guys. I think there's so much material with on Photoshop out there that, and I don't think it's integral. I really don't think that Photoshop is integral to game development. It's more of a texturing. Look, it's called Photoshop, okay? So it's nice to know it, because at some point you may need to modify a texture, like let's say I don't know, like a cement texture or brick texture, or wood texture, any kind of texture. You need to generate some noise or create some kind of texture on your own. Yes, Photoshop is a great tool, but it's not an essential thing to have for game development. And as such, I'm going to skip the whole Photoshop thing here. So I hope you understand now how this whole thing works, and just have a better view on what steps you need to undertake before you actually even begin programming stuff in UE4. Because Painter, well, albeit smaller, has a similar breakdown, right, in terms of workflow and pipeline. It's very small compared to Maya. Obviously, Painter is a much smaller program, but not nearly as problematic, so to speak. And there's loads of power in Painter. It's good stuff. There's that, and that's why we're going to talk about high poly object and how we're going to use that to create some maps. Obviously, whatever Painter does, it is possible to do in Maya, but I do think that Painter, look, it's basically a specialized software, and it does what it says on the tin can, and it's good stuff, because especially they work very well together with UE4. Not only UE4 comes preloaded with the Painter plugin. I don't know if it's preloaded or not. Substance plugin, I believe it is. But anyway, point is that they work with the same tangent space, which is great, and like a lot of good stuff happens. Now, obviously, before you export, you triangulate your stuff and you check it out and clean it up, and then you import into UE4. And at this point, it doesn't matter which route you take, because you could either go ahead and create your game entirely without any textures on, and just use some basic materials. And then after you have your minimum viable product, you could go ahead and put stuff in Painter and finish up your painting, because you're just changing the visuals at that point. You're not really changing mechanics. or anything like that. So it doesn't really matter where you go at this point. But usually, what happens is you'd be better off just having some objects being painted, because you just want to be sure. Like, look, you don't need to have a complete, like, everything in your game to be completely textured, in day one. But you want to have, for example, your character done, and maybe your main weapon done, and maybe, let's say, a couple of enemies done, right? Just so that you see what the general vibe in your game is gonna look like, is gonna be. You don't want to have like an inconsistent art style with that, and that's why you just want to be sure that whatever kind of art style you're taking will fit your game, or if you're happy. So if you're not happy with a particular art style, let's say you go for cell shading, and it just doesn't work that well. You would have only lost the time to paint 3 or 4 characters, whereas if you painted the whole thing, you'd have to redo the whole, obviously, all of your whole style. Now, that's a very rare occasion where the artist doesn't like their style, and before you start worrying about your art style in the game, you really need to actually have a game. My point is here is the fact that without Maya, none of these other steps are possible. I mean, they are, especially in UE4, now that they will include, as far as I know, they will include in the near future a modeling toolkit, albeit a very basic one. It's still possible to make a game with Unreal. In fact, Unreal is so powerful that you could probably make a game with just the menu system. But depending on what you do, UE4, yes, it is capable of making a game, but knowing Maya, and depending on the game you're doing, sometimes Maya is the first step. And most of the time I find that it is, unless you go for 2D, where you go for something like Inkscape or Adobe Illustrator, and then you use something like Spriter. As you see, I have Spriter Pro. It's a good piece of software. It's basically the same thing as Maya, but in 2D, and much cleaner, because you can animate using bones and layers. Much like skinning and rigging in Maya, this is the same thing in Spriter, but with sprites. So it's a little bit easier to work with. And then obviously download Inkscape if you have a particular drive towards the 2D games. Unfortunately, that's where you have to do your own lighting, and the art style there is much more distinct. So you have to be really at home with your painting here. Anyway, that being said, let's go ahead and just take a look at how this is going to look again on the Maya screen. So first and foremost, obviously remember that always make sure that your workspace is clear and clean. In other words, there's no clutter, right? If I go ahead, I'm just going to save this. Well, I'm not going to save this, but if I go ahead and open this, I'm going to save this current workspace. Okay, I can't actually. Well, I need to save this. I wonder if I can. There we go. I just opened my outliner by mistake. That's great. How did I open my outliner? I don't want this outliner here. Just when I start talking about the layout, and it always something like this happens. Anyway, my point is here that when you have, just make sure that your workspace, it doesn't look like this. Okay, I do find this to be very cluttered, and actually your workspace wouldn't actually even look only like this. You're gonna have another set of menus. All these menus will be all the way up here, and you're gonna have a bunch of other menus over here as well. So it's gonna be quite, at least in my eyes, it is fairly annoying. Okay, obviously I don't need the helpline either here. So as you can see, I've got loads of space to work with, and I have all the things that I need under my cursor. So create your own workflow, but I do think that obviously second monitors are very helpful here, as you may have already noticed that a lot of these editors are pretty big in their own right. So having a second monitor is going to be a huge speed up to your workflow, because you can just have it flicked on the side and just work with your keyframes on that side and see the results on your main monitor. Okay, so what you essentially do is always, right, you start with your create menu, which is from here. Make sure to, if you're going to use something, you're going to create a bunch of primitives. Let's say pop pop off a menu and work with it. Remember, that was this way of working. You can have an interactive creation, which allows you to interactively create stuff. In other words, well, I just created a plane, so this doesn't really count. But let's say something like this, right? It allows you to create these objects in a much cleaner fashion. I'm going to turn this off because I'm not a fan of this. And you should too, by the way, because it's almost always better to have your objects in the origin. Obviously, as you bake, you can move them to origin, but never forget to set up the pivot on the correct position. Now, obviously, that's not the only way. My preferred method is using the right mouse button. Now, remember, right mouse button is your context-sensitive menu. So if I go ahead and just create a polycube, right mouse button is going to give you all the selection modes here, and then you're going to have your attribute pop-outs here. You're going to your selection set, major selection functions. So I suppose, and then you got your DG traversal, which is like your essentially your attribute editor traversal, as far as I understand. Inputs, outputs, this is your history essentially. Never used paint, but you can actually sculpt, so that's pretty cool. You could go into sculpting from here. Also, it's obviously possible in other ways. You got your actions, which are essentially part of your I don't know, template on a template. You have that as a as layers. So you've got all that jazz, parent and unparent. That's a shortcut there in the bounding box. I don't know what that is. Color sets, that's obviously available to you as well. Time editor, that's for your animation here. You've got the material attributes for your material, assuming you have any. And then you got your material setups here, such as fonts, like which one you have favorites and which are existing. And you can obviously remove a material override. After that, you've got your shift, which is you can think of it as an operation menu set. So if you think of oh, come on, are you serious? Come on. If you think of the right mouse button as your overall context sensitive menu, shift right, obviously all of them are context sensitive, but adding shift to the right mouse button will always give you a toolkit and several operations that are available to you within this. Now, if I go ahead and extrude this, which by the way is available with Control E, and I'm going to go ahead and just extrude this. Notice that I can exit this, right? And if I select my object and press T, this will pick up your last input and will show you, these. It will show you these, setups over here, allowing you to play around with your with your extrusion. So there's that. The next thing you have is obviously you have control, which is, remember, whenever you press control right mouse button, that's all your selection conversion. So you got to this, to this, to this. I rarely use this, but the good thing about it is the fact that it's consistent. You use this after you already have a selection. So think about it this way: whenever you have a selection already, you convert it using control. Having control shift is anything that is going to modify your future selections. So you got your symmetry, and then obviously that symmetry works with object, the world, etc. Sorry, over here you got topology on different things, such as like you can actually define topology. And then here you can actually say preserve UVs, which is important to preserve them once you have them. You've got your little options here, which are going to pop off on this side if you actually don't have them open. Then you've got your transform constraints, which is available as well on this side, and your selection constraints. So all these constraints are good if, let's say, you don't want to deform your geometry too badly. Essentially, this is like the leftovers of whatever couldn't fit on the right mouse button. Most of the time, this is just your symmetry, and that's what you mostly be using for. What else we've got here? Remember that your toolkits are assigned in such a way that they reflect your workflow. Obviously, you can go ahead and modify these over here. So you got your hotbox controls. You can have which ones, like what kind of styles you have, and you can actually define which parts you want. Maybe you don't want to show, maybe you just need the modeling only, for example, and this will hide the rest of these the rest of these three lines, and we'll leave only the mesh, edit mesh, mesh tools, mesh display, curve surfaces, all that, deforms, all that stuff is going to be available, and the rest of it is going to be gone. Obviously, you got your recent commands on this side, and then you've got your such as you got your little masks here on the left side. You've got your perspectives on the top. You've got your tool like editors, viewers type of deal on the bottom, and then you've got your like different lines, and then the attributes here. All these things are available to you as well. I do find, for crying out loud, how did I manage to do that? Get rid of it. I don't want the show. So yeah, all these things are available to you. I honestly don't use most of these because I do think if you go to attributes and just going like this is a pain in the ass. As usual, wow, how did how did this happen? Just how does this keep happening? Just get away from me, shelf. Freaking, attachment issues with the shelf here. Okay, so now if we take a look here on the side, remember that your channel box and layer editor and attribute editor usually are tied together with Control A. Also, don't forget to set up your hotkeys so that you can work properly with hotkeys. Make sure to save them separately here, and then tick the save your workspace with the hotkeys. With the hotkey set, because every time you load your Maya, every time you open Maya, you're going to be set to the default, and you're going to have to go ahead and load your own hotkey. So I'm not sure where exactly this was happening from. I believe it was from the workspace settings. If we go into workspaces, I believe it was possible. If you go into settings here, you can actually, yeah. So you choose a hotkey set every time you load this. It will actually link your hotkey set with this workspace, which is good. That's what you want. Make sure to use your layers over here. So create layers, and these layers will help you out with creating geometry. Avoid using these, even though they're available to you. I really recommend you just stick to the time editor because it's non-destructive and it's a lot more powerful than this layer editor here. And I believe it's a lot easier to understand, really. Not to mention that it's not limited, whereas animation here is limited. You're limited to 2 layers in Maya LT at least. What else? Don't forget to use your your transform freezes. So if you go ahead and move this, and let's say we wanted to have this ready for export, use D. Always use D to set up your pivot. Don't forget that X, C, and V create different snap options. So X is going to snap to the grid, C is going to snap to the curve, and V is going to hold, as you hold these, it's going to snap to the vertex. And let's say you snap this over here. Now don't forget to zero your stuff out. So if you zero this out, that means that it basically allows you to to reset your transform, so that whenever you zero this out, this is your new default position. Also, don't forget to delete your history once you're done with any modifications that you have. Obviously, you can have these inputs here and just have a different you can like basically work on these different things. And this is actually a good example of what's going to happen if I go ahead and I'm going to delete the history here, okay? And this is my history gone. So if you ever have something like this where you have your black faces, this means that your normals are broken. So if I go ahead and just separate this, right? And if I take a look at my mesh display, and I just have to flip normals. Come on, where's the freaking normal flip? Reverse, there you go. So reverse your faces, and there are your normals. So this is like, it usually happens sometimes in Maya, so don't let it get to you too much. Obviously this is going to create another node, and once you're done with that, you want to delete that node so that you have the final result here. So make sure just to stay on top of your history. Don't let it stack for too long, because this is going to create issues later down the line. You don't want that. Now I'm not sure what's here, what's this bit for here. So let's say I extrude this, and I extruded this, but this is not really a smart way to go about this. And again, I have my normals flipped, which is quite annoying. So let's say I separate these again, and I do this whole thing on this side. Actually, there we go. So if I go ahead and, by the way, remember that Y and G, these are your previous tool and previous function commands. So in this case, I don't really need to, but make sure to use them all the time, because this considerably speeds up your workflow. I'm just gonna reverse this again as well. Now I'm not sure why this is like this empty bit here, what's it for, but I suppose whenever you got your different inputs, I mean, it just disappears. I don't know. It's a strange thing to have in the middle of something. Make sure to keep, like I said, your outliner thingy clean. Shift the left mouse button will basically unroll the whole hierarchy. There's a couple of other selection sets. Now I'm going through this a little bit fast because we already talked about this. I'm just trying to give you an idea of how to operate. In the attribute editor, you basically anything that is not available to you in the channel box is going to be available to you in the attribute editor. So make sure to, oops, I duplicated this. Make sure to use your attribute editor whenever you go into things like, in this case, you don't really want the tangent space because, like I said, this has nothing to do with. Just don't bother with tangent space in Maya because we're not going to be calculating tangents and binomials when we export. So anything in the attribute editor you want to play around with, by all means, play around with. You've got your material stuff here. All that jazz is available to you. What else we have here is the fact that we don't have any layers created. Make sure to use all the tools available to you, such as curves, surfaces, and deforms, because depending on what you need to do, you can actually, you may achieve the same result better with a curve, right? When you go ahead and create, let's say, a particular curve and then deform it with a bend. And then in the surfaces, you just revolve something or loft along it or just have a planar, play around with these tools available to you and see what happens, right? Once you're done with your modeling, you go ahead into this second situation here where you just go ahead and start skinning, right? You create your own joints, right? You start create joints, click on your joints, create them. Make sure to orient your joints. Never forget to orient them. So you go into your skeleton again, you go into orient joint, and you select your axes the way you want them to work. Obviously, you can do so manually. Don't forget that in the display here, you've got your little, your setups here, such as your heads-up display, like animation details, camera names, all that jazz. Hiding objects, so you can isolate objects with Control 1. If I go ahead and select this, Control 1 will isolate this object, allowing me to work just on that. Or I could just select several objects and hide them, and then obviously I can unhide them from the outliner if I lose my selection. You've got little things such as making an object live, allowing things to snap onto it, right? What else? I mean, there's really loads of stuff we already talked about, but just make sure to use all these tools available to create your IK joints, right? So this first one, second one, and then let's say you create your IK joints. Ah, crap, I auto-save this. Okay, that's fine, whatever. So you create your IK handle from start to finish. Right, and then you start working from there on out, right? So this is your IK. So it's fairly fast to work with. You can create a lot of different things, but like I said, always make sure to set up your rig correctly. All these pole vectors, etc. They have to be pointing at the appropriate angle if you want it to work correctly. And then, like I said, have your have your bones pointing in the right direction as well. So your local joints, joints local orientation axes have to be correctly set up. In this case, they are, I think. So in my case, it's not a big deal. Obviously, remember the last joint in your joint chain should always have its local axis reflect the world axis. In other words, have to be completely neutral, because just to make sure that you don't get some weird results once you start rotating stuff around. Okay, that being said, what else do we have here? Obviously, you start after skinning your stuff. After that, you've got your weights. I'm pretty sure by now you would know how annoying that is, but you'll get used to it eventually, and hopefully my Autodesk will release a better set of tools. Then you got your deforms, which are the same as your deforms over here, and then you got your constraints, obviously, for your control rigs over here, and your controls, which are essentially tags, so you can have a separate hierarchy for your control. This is only done basically for people that move their controls with the arrow keys left and right, up and down, and that's just easier for you, because if you go into your outliner and you see it, there's, like in this case, if I go into my outliner and I just go let's say up and down, right? This is going to go up and down my hierarchy. But if I got a bunch of curves here, right, they're going to get in the way. And let's say I want to go down from my elbow to my wrist, but instead there's like a bunch of intermediate curves and some, you know, all sorts of other parenting constraints and all that. I'm going to actually end up selecting those, which I don't want. So that's why you have your, you know, this this control menu set here. I really don't think you're going to find it useful unless you have something very complicated. Well, not very complicated, but fairly complex. After that, you got your animation, which you go into with your keys, right? You key whatever it is. I recommend you don't key the whole thing. You just key a particular channel. Make sure to use breakdowns when you need them, and obviously set your driven keys for things that usually driven keys are used for vertex animation. So if you go ahead and change something, let's say an object transforms into another object, usually you want to do so through a driven key because it's a form of control. In almost no situation do you want to hard key a particular vertex. Let's say you want to create a particular vertex animation, right? And you go and select these vertices and you just let's say you scale them up and down, right? And then you move them up and down in such a way and you key this in like this, and then you do something fancy. You're gonna lose it, right? Even if you use the dope sheet, you're gonna lose your keys. Well, you're not gonna lose them, but you'll have a hard time finding them. And then you gotta select them correctly, especially if you use things such as soft select. So if I go ahead and press B, obviously remember that soft select is kind of like the sculpting bit. Speaking of soft select, holding down B will always you know, allow you to select like a bigger or small, basically change the brush size. M is going to change the magnitude, well, assuming you had a magnitude. So holding down M changes the magnitude usually. And then obviously if you hold down B, you can and move with your, instead of left mouse button, use your middle mouse button. You always start from the beginning. So if I have something huge, and then you will notice that if I try to lower it down, right, let's say it's like this, and I try to lower it down, it starts from here. Whereas if I just use my middle mouse button, it always starts from the center. So that's basically it when it comes to your modeling setup here. Afterwards, when you're done with your keys, you will go ahead and take a look at your playback, right? You can playback this, see how it works, go into your graph editor, set up a couple of different things. Make sure whenever you're in the graph editor, let's say the workflow, this is how the workflow looks like, okay? So you got your graph editor, you got your basic animation. Let's say your object moves, this object moves from here, right? And then you go into frame number 10 and it goes over here. Okay, this is frame number 10 and your object goes over here and you have this set. And if you go ahead and play this over, you're gonna have this particular movement. This is how this works. Then after that, you go into your, not into the dope sheet, you go into your time editor, which is over here. So this is your time editor, and you add your clip to the selection. So you add selected content, and from now on, your animation is driven from your time editor. Whenever you're happy, like once you do whatever it is you do with this animation, let's say you want to create a new one, you simply mute this thing, or you just press Q on it, and this will mute and unmute it, allowing you to create new animation. Then you go back into your graph editor, right? And you're back in frame 0. And then you go ahead and let's say, okay, from here on out, I want this to be over here. I'm going to set this as this, and then I'm going to scale it up. This is my second clip, right? And I'm going to set my scale up over here, and this way it's going to work nice and dandy. Now you're going to go into your time editor over here, right? Remember, it's still muted, so it's not driving your animation. Even if you move this clip does not, like nothing works here, right? So you're going to create a new animation track, and then you're going to add your animation from this selection. You notice that you got 2 now, although there's like you just lost your keyframes. That's because you transported everything from your graph editor into your time editor. Now if I go ahead and unlock this and I just mute this over here, now I'm going to have the same animation on this side. Obviously I can go ahead and edit this. So if you select a particular a clip and you go into your graph editor, this will allow you to see what kind of animation you've created, what kind of animation you've done, and you will edit this, and then you go back into your time editor. Notice that it's also, everything in the time editor is in the outliner, so you can have a much easier understanding of how your animation sources work, and what kind of compositions you have and how many tracks you've got. Okay, and then obviously once you're done, you can blend between these two. So in my case, one of them moves it from left to right, the other one scales it, and if I use both of them, this thing will all but basically move from left to right. Okay, sort of. So if I go ahead and, oops, I don't want to ghost this, but notice that if I if I actually ghost both of these, notice that I get the middle result here, and then obviously I blend between the two. You can obviously have your weights. You can keyframe the weight on this, so you can have, let's say, your movement to be 0.5 or just your scale to be 0.5, and this will have a weight of 1, and this will create a different type of animation. Obviously in this case, as you can see, the object gets closer. Obviously if you have a weight of 0, you're not going to really be adding any influence to the output or the final output. Make sure to use layers. So you know, we can go ahead and create a layer on this. Make sure to group this stuff. So let's say I group this together, right? Control G, and then I decide to create a additive layer, which is what you usually want. You can pop this over and you can start adding stuff to your layers, such as these two idiots, right? And you can just add them to your add the selection to your layer. You can start working from there on out. Set up different keys, right? Just using S. So as you can see, there's different setups over here. Pressing another S, and here are all my keys. Maybe I needed to change something, such as its overall position. I set it over here. This overwrite is essentially gonna, this is like an additive right now, but I could say maybe I wanted to have a much smaller impact, like 0.2, and this will change my overall result. And notice that because this has less keyframes, I'm actually not moving over here. I'm actually getting, you know, these keyframes don't have an impact over the rest of the animation. And once you're done, obviously you go ahead and open your game exporter, right? You select your particular object, or if you have a object set from here, so you set it up from export all, either from the selection or from the set of your objects. You take a look at these sets over here. If you go into create, you've got your sets, and you just create either a partition or quick selection set or regular set or an empty group, which is just Control G. This actually has a very nice handy little toolkit here, which are your measuring tools, such as your distance and your arc length and all these. If you have like curves, you want to see what you're doing. Annotations are only for if you have teammates. You probably don't need those. Locators are nice. It allows you to select stuff that's such as you know, vertex clusters. You can select them much easier. You've got your free image plane, which you probably don't need because you have reference image planes from your shading menu over here. Sorry, from the view menu over here. So you've got your image plane. You can create one. You don't really need to go ahead and create your own. You know, maybe you want free image plane for something else. I don't know. Then you got your construction planes, which essentially allow you to snap things onto them, right? So you can snap a particular object onto the plane. So there's that, and what else? I mean, you got your text and you got your Illustrator object if you have Illustrator, which I don't. So there's that. And yeah, you've got your whole setup here. You got your edit menus here, which allows you to group and ungroup things. Levels of detail are handy. We're not going to do this in our game because our game is fairly simple. But as you get into bigger and bigger games, you want to have several versions of your objects, not only with less and more polygons, but also with different, well, they're basically called MIP maps, allowing you to, meaning that they're smaller resolution. The textures get smaller in resolution, right? The further you are away, let's say if something is this close to the camera, you're going to be using a 1024 texture, whereas, or let's say, okay, this is your 4K texture, right? Let's say this is some kind of a barrel with a 4K texture on it. And you don't really need that 4K texture all the way over here because no player is actually going to see, nobody's going to see the definition, okay? Nobody's going to see the detail, and that's why you have these levels of detail. And Unreal Engine works with those. By default, it actually creates its own, you know, basically simplifies the mesh, and I believe it also lowers the resolution of textures on its own. I'm not too sure what the story is there right now because I haven't used that system that much. But I've played around a little bit with it, and it's pretty cool. It saves you a lot of work. Obviously, there's others like I believe there's one thing called Simplygon, which is better at simplifying. Geez, profiles, better at simplifying your mesh, right? And that's what you want to do manually, ideally, if you want to get a better, um, like a more optimized game. But you know, depending on how much time you have, you may not be able to do that. So anyway, back on topic. Whenever you're done with your animation, you're gonna have to export it, and ideally, probably you want to use your game exporter. So if you're gonna export the model, which I don't recommend. Actually, no, you can export the model here, but I don't recommend exporting the animation with it. Ideally, you want to export the model with the skeleton if you have the skeleton, so that you have the animation into the skeleton afterwards. Unless it's obviously a vertex animation where you got something like a set-driven key or some kind of a bend, light blend, deformer, right? Something like that. And then obviously you want your animation to be set. Make sure to have your up axis always to be on Z, because that's the case in every situation. Obviously this is the same as exporting by hand, by the way. So unless you like, it's pretty much the same as grabbing this and saying I'm gonna export this, which is my selection, and with all these options I'm gonna export, and then I've got the availability to select the exact same settings that I do over here. Difference is obviously that the game exporter is basically working off a preset, which is whatever your previous preset is, right? And you can actually modify a lot of these options over here. Now, if you want to drill down, let's say tangents and binormals, we don't want that, so we're going to take this off, right? So that's what you're going to be doing, but then they're available to you here as well. So you take them off and basically choose what you want to export. You can export your model, your animation clips, which are only from your graph editor. And this is basically for people that use the animation layers, because generally speaking, you will have your clips in the time editor and you will simply be loading them up from the time editor over here. Obviously, move your stuff to origin. This is what you want almost every time when you have an animation, especially when this kind of animation will be driven in Unreal, unless you have some kind of pre-rendered movies. Most of the time, it's better to save your multiple clips because it allows you a more composition-based workflow, allowing you to have modular approaches to your characters and imports, and it's basically more robust. File sizes are smaller, and hierarchies are more structured and organized instead of having. Look, it's better to have 10 punches than a whole combo. Okay, because with these 10 punches, you can combine and recombine them as many ways as you want, but with a combo, you're stuck with that combo, okay? So whenever you're making animations, make sure to have your animations created in such a way that they can be easily cut apart and used for particular, for different purposes, even reused. In many cases, it's a huge time saver to reuse particular animations, especially if you can do it with grace in such a way that the player does not notice it. So yeah, when it comes to this, obviously, like I said, you have your up axis here. Check your FBX version before you export. Check with the Unreal documentation to see which version of Unreal supports which FBX version. Move your stuff to origin and have stuff almost always in multiple clip files. As for the models, most of the time you do want to have them. You don't really want your smoothing group. Your smooth mesh to be on. You want to triangulate them most of the time. Ideally, you should do this before you export, but either the import in Unreal Engine 4 can triangulate it, or the export in Maya can triangulate it. But if you really want to have a good control of what's the story and how your mesh is going to look like, you want to do this before you export. You want to triangulate using the command here, which is in the mesh tools. In the edit mesh, and you got your triangulate. Okay, if I can find it. There we go. You just triangulate your stuff and see what happens. And then obviously work off of that so that you have a much better setup. Okay. Make sure to have loads of backups. Autosave frequently. You try to use your save increments, for example, if you want to select, use your the correct export options. Whenever you want to export something really quick, just send it to a particular engine, which is either Unity or Unreal. I realize not everybody uses Unreal, and you may have a particular use out of this tutorial series if you use Unity as well. But because I'm using Unreal, I can't really help you with that. I used to run on Unity, but I'm not a fan of it. Anyway, that being said, that's really the whole workflow. Obviously, don't forget to set up your UVs, right? So your UVs, this is not going to look like this anymore. I mean, it's still going to be on this side, I believe, but it will be part of, it will be much better integrated in the next version of Maya, which should be hitting, stores soon. Well, not stores, but like Maya LT at least. My current Maya is 2017, but obviously the LT 2018 is going to have a much better, much more robust UV editor. Not this mess, especially if you open it up and there's all this jazz on it. I mean, look, it's workable. It's just much. It's not. It's just a little bit of a mess. Okay, so whatever they've done, I don't know. I'm excited to check it out. To check all the tools out. Make sure to download the bonus tools. They're a big help, especially for UVing. So if you go ahead here and you got your bonus tools, you will notice that you have a lot of tools here that you can work with. Okay, so you got your different displays, your modifiers, your creates, right? You've got your modeling setups here, which is going to speed up significantly your modeling, like selecting different edges. You got your UV editing stuff, such as your wireframe color setups, and really the best one is the auto unwrap UV tools, especially for tubes. If you go ahead and click this, the pipe tube contour is really good at unwrapping stuff, especially if you have something that's already textured. Obviously, you got your modifiers here to nudge and rotate UVs, etc. Very, very, very cool stuff. It's just that you don't use them that often, but whenever you need them, it's nice to know that they're there, because sometimes they may save you a lot of work. Same goes for animation. You've got your walk cycle control, which I've actually never done. Copy set driven key, that's pretty cool, but I never used walk cycle control. I really don't know what that does. Obviously, check the documentation whenever you're stuck. Okay, whenever you're stuck, and even if you're not stuck, if you're just not sure what something does, let's say you try to, I don't know, let's grab this mesh and let's just go into a particular setup. Let's say we want to go ahead and edit the edge flow. Now let's say you only have like adjust edge flow. Like, what does this mean, right? You don't know what this means. You may not need this, but you don't know what it does. So if you go ahead and click on help, this will go ahead and show you what kind of setting this is and what it's going to do once you say it. So if you got, let's say, here's what it says: adjust the edge flow. Is basically gonna to see what happens. Okay, well, this is not really helpful, but all right, so there you go. That's what it does. It basically straightens the distance between two edges. So edge flow is maintaining the shape at one, and I don't know what it does. I never had to do it. I usually do this manually, but look, in some cases this might actually help you out. Okay, if you have some very specific case. Now, obviously, in my case, I probably would have done this kind of operation manually, but in some cases, you may have to. It might actually be better off doing this with this edge flow thing. All right. Point in case is that nobody really knows everything about Maya. I mean, there probably is some freak out there who knows everything about Maya, but they've been working on this for 20 years and they wouldn't be that well versed in other things. And you shouldn't really be feeling bad about this. And if anything, it's a little bit more exciting when you've got stuff to learn and you always find new tricks with Maya. Even veterans, I see people that have like 20, 30, well, not 20, but 10, 15 years worth of experience in the industry, and they still find new stuff. And don't worry about future releases of Maya. As you can see, they keep everyone happy. If anything, this thing is too bloated with old garbage. There's just so many ways to access every menu that I think this is why the learning curve of Maya is so hard. So try to eliminate it and just do what I do, because it will give you like a consistent way into menus, and it will reduce the learning curve significantly, because you're not going to have your confusion be like, okay, so I got my shelf here, right, in this shelf, and there's all my drop down menus over here, which are my menu sets and shelf sets, and I've got my workspaces on the right here, and I've got my menu sets and shelf sets on this left here, and this affects on how my how my options are available at the top, and then I've got these things at the bottom, right, and then there's my tool set here, and I've got my UV modeling toolkit on the right. Like, there's a bunch of shit that you don't really need you can work with them, quite efficiently without all that jazz. And I believe that that's one of the reasons Maya has such a reputation of being completely, like, extremely difficult to learn, and it completely is, because believe it or not, what I've talked about here, what we've talked about so far, what we've went through, is probably about 30% of what Maya is, if that, maybe 20. Uh, um, this, I think, yeah, I'd say this is about 20% of Maya, what you've seen so far. I mean, I'm talking about like the overall Maya, like the actual, like the full Maya, right? Not the LT version, just the full Maya. This is about 60% of the LT of what we've talked through. Maybe more, maybe even 70, I'd say 70% of LT. But you see, the big Maya, the fat Maya, is actually it supports Python scripting, and the amount of tools that you get there and all these plugins, it's much like an operating system in its own right. So if you want to go and dive into that, feel free. But I do feel much more liberated, despite having a lack of particular tool sets, such as the art tool from Unreal Engine 4, which, if you decide to use Maya, the regular Maya, I highly recommend you download, because it's going to speed up your workflow with humanoids significantly. Significantly, yeah. So yeah, guys, there's that. I really don't think there's much else I can add to this whole conversation. You really don't need the texture baking and the lighting and shading, because we're pretty much we're gonna do this in Painter. Go through this if you really want to. Again, you can always go through the documentation, which is always going to be a help for you. And I'm really happy with the way it's available. You can just go ahead and just, let's say, Play Blast. Oh well, what the hell is Play Blast? Well, I don't know. Open the health file, and this is going to show you and tell you what Play Blast is. Essentially a glorified way of making YouTube videos and just quick video files and renders. Obviously, this is not a renderer, by the way. This is just a quick, like, you can send this to someone, for example, and they will just take a look at what you've created, right? So that you can preview your animation and share it with someone. Anyway, that being said, guys, I'm gonna end this video on this note, because I think I've said as much as I could say about Maya. Really, I could spend a lot more time talking on it. But I think, to be fair, this is like the extent of my knowledge of Maya as well. So I wouldn't really be able to give you any more information on something particular. Like I already told you, I don't really know what everything does in LT, let alone in the big fat Maya. And there's loads of different tricks you can work with. Obviously, you got your marketplace on, you've got your things. Always make sure, by the way, if you need something to be shown, use your windows to grab your editors. Anything that's an editor is in the windows. Anything that can be shown or will be shown is in the display, so you can check out your local axes here, such as vertex normals, face normals, all that, UVs. Everything will be available to you from the display menu set. And you've got your modify here, which is essentially center pivots. You can bake your pivots, which usually happens by default. Snap align, all these usually are available to you. Obviously, you can create your custom attributes to things. So if I go ahead and select this and create a custom attribute, and you have to see what it does. This is a little bit of programming with Mel scripting and all that, but in reality, it's a lot more simpler, much simpler. Okay, so you can create different controls for this. Just play around with these, right? You can go ahead and open the help file. These custom attributes. Rarely do I find myself needing one, to be honest with you, because it just so happens that these custom attributes are mostly useful whenever you have some plugin or you want to script on it. And when you try to do something really fancy, which involves animation, in other words, animation is going to be rendered. Usually, look, it depends on your workflow, okay? Try these, see what happens. Maybe you like it, maybe you won't. You've got all these data types, which we'll go through when we go into Unreal, but, they're data types, so they're the same across every single programming language. So, vectors, floats, booleans, all that. And you can definitely go ahead and make your own thing. Maybe try to, I don't know, have a driven key. Instead of having a set driven key, just have an attribute that does what the driven key does, which is entirely possible to do, right? You've got all these options. So make sure to just play around with your software and see what you can do, okay? Maybe start from something simple. I mean, by now you should have a couple of assets ready anyway, but If you want to really further your game, maybe, I don't know, go ahead and recreate your computer one-to-one, or maybe create something that, you know, created in such a way that it has so very few polygons, right? Very optimized, very tight mesh. Or maybe do the opposite, create a mesh that's going to be highly detailed without any concern on how many polygons you've got, right? Create something that has thousands of polygons. We can subdivide it thousands of times, right? This is how this thing's gonna look if I subdivide it, by the way. Also, yeah, don't forget to use your 1, 2, 3, 4. All these view modes over here. Obviously, they're available to you from view, and from shading, and from lighting. All these things available to you on these the space menu. Really, this is Maya right here. You're looking at Maya. If you know everything in this menu, you know Maya. There you go. Very simple, very simple. So get to it. You'll get to know it in no time. Make sure to keep an eye on your verts and your polygons and your edges. Sorry, basically on your polygons. That's what you want to be keeping count on. But really, it's the triangles that are the more important. But then, you know, it doesn't really matter in most cases, because a triangle is 2 triangles is a polygon. Make sure to have your edge flow correct as well. Your topology, have basically common sense in whenever you're modeling something, and always think of what the player is going to see. Don't add too much detail to stuff that's never going to be seen. Let's say you're creating a game, and, you know, the shock absorber is going to be seen, you know, just once out of a very particular angle for your car. So don't go ahead and make the shock absorber be with thousands of faces on. You don't really need that much detail on a part that's going to be barely seen. You wanna balance that for your characters. It is true that computers get more and more powerful, and, you know, you need to be less and less concerned about size and performance and all them bottlenecks for your releases, unless obviously you're releasing for mobile. But it also has to do with the size of your game. In my case, really, with the worms, I could get away with having 1,000,000 polygons in just one worm. Okay. 1,000,000 polygons is not going to be that big of a deal for a computer. Obviously, if we release for mobile, it will be an issue. But, you know, 1,000,000 polygons is not that many, you know, in today's day and age. Definitely, what you don't want to be having 1,000,000 polygons, but nothing. You know, it's not going to be that bad if you do. Okay. If you manage to fit 1,000,000 polygons in something very small, actually. Anyway. That's it, guys. That's it from me. That's it from I mean, not from me, but from UV4. So UV4 from Maya LT, not UV4 and not UV4. I'm sorry, I'm starting like I haven't slept. I gotta go sleep. But just wanted to make sure that you understand how this whole lockdown thing works. Basically, get comfortable with working with it, because you'll need a lot. You'll use a lot, and from this point onwards, you're on your own. You have enough knowledge to build upon, and really, if you have went through what we've just talked about, I really do think that you're halfway on your way of making a game, because I believe that this is the harder part. I believe this is the harder part. I think programming is a much simpler concept. It's very logical. It doesn't require thousands of tools. You know, it requires just some basic knowledge. And as long as you have some basic logic, you really can make a lot of things happen. Whereas in Maya, you really need to know all these tool sets and all these setups and how all this works. You got all these freaking things, right? So I'll see you guys next time when we start talking about Painter and how we're going to export and import. Maybe we're going to go through Unreal Engine 4 first, see what we've done, how it's going to look in Engine, modify some files in this case if it doesn't look too good, right? And then we're gonna go into Painter and talk about how we're gonna paint our worm. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see what's next video, but for now, as of now, the Maya part of the playlist, the Maya part of the whole tutorial series of everything that has to, you know, about game creation, that bit is done. So that's it for me. Bye bye.